My name is Ruben Roqueñi, and I am the Director of Transformative Change Programs at the Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're here for Ideas in Action with Danielle Geller and K-Ming Chang. I'm here to introduce tonight's event. We're partnering with One World to make virtual space for a conversation between these two brilliant writers. Their work explores the experience of uncovering truths through writing and the constraints and possibilities inherent in our individual heritage. So I'm going to go ahead and just share a screen here. Just talk a little bit about the foundation. And there we go. Whoops, it's showing you this view. Oh well, so it's not important. So again, I'm at Native Arts and Cultures Foundation. I just want to shout out where I'm sitting now. I'm in Portland, Oregon. I am from the Yaqui communities in northern Mexico and southeast Arizona, where my family's from. Here in Portland, there's a bunch of tribes on these rivers. Today, there's people from all over the country. 60,000 strong, our Native community here, over 350,000 or over 350 tribes represented in this area. Our mission is to basically support the creative endeavors of Native people in order to make change in And so we began our, oh wow, this is going too fast. So we began our journey about 10 years ago, and we were set up to recognize Native creativity, heal the damage of history, and support the cultural continuity for generations of Native artists and culture bearers. We launched our programming in 2010, and over the course of the next 10 years, we've nurtured the creative life of Native people by offering support to individual artists, organizations, and communities. Our work has featured a number of programs, including our fellowships program, which established our footprint in the field. After our 10th year, we moved into a period of reflection and planning. And during that time, we conducted research amongst the arts and cultural community to set the course for the next phase of our journey. This new focus of our work, we believe, can collectively help shift the prevalent narrative by presenting more accurate and realistic information about Native peoples to our stakeholders and the general public, believers and non-believers. And to achieve this end, we've formulated some priorities to advance artists' social change work, increase the invisibility and creative power of Native artists, to educate the public, and partner across sectors. Next slide. So one of these changes is that a new program has manifested in what we're calling SHIFT, Transformative Change and Indigenous Arts Program. The program is essentially a slate of services that includes professional development training, convening, a whole host of other ways that we can support our artists to help them realize their projects. And of course, there's a financial aspect to this as well. The awards are $100,000 over 2 years, and we'll be awarding 10 projects this year. Nice little graphic we have here. So thank you again for inviting us to participate. And with that, I'd like to hand this over to Nicole Counts, who is the senior editor at One World, and she will be in conversation tonight with Danielle and K-Ming. Take it away, Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation, for doing the work that you're doing. We don't always have our guests that come on share a presentation like that, but I'm really glad to know more. So thank you all for being here. This is our series Ideas X Action that we bring in our One World authors, and we get to have these kind of incredible conversations. So without further ado, I will introduce, first we have K-Ming Chang, who was born in the year of the tiger. She is a Kundiman Fellow and a Lambda Literary Award finalist in poetry. She is a poet, writer, and teacher. Raised in California, she is now based in New York. Hello. And then next we have Danielle Geller, who is a writer of personal essays and memoir. She received her MFA in creative writing for nonfiction at the University of Arizona and was a Rana Jaffe Writers Award. I'm sorry, and won a Rana Jaffe Writers Award in 2016. She lives with her husband and 2 cats in British Columbia, where she teaches creative writing at the University of Victoria. She is a member of the Navajo Nation, born to the Sitnanji, born for the white man. Hello. Hi, you both. I realized I didn't say the titles of either of your books. K-Ming Chang came out with her debut novel, Bestiary, and Danielle Geller, who wrote the memoir Dog Flowers, which came out, 3 weeks ago now. It's
wait, what? 3 years?
Yeah, January 12th. Yeah,
January 12th.
2 weeks. It's what is time?
What is time?
But I'm so happy to have you both here with me. And I'm excited to talk everything from family secrets to birds. So I thought maybe we could just start with, just because both of your books are so interesting to me, all the layers that are in them. So if you could start by telling us kind of the origin of how why you decided to write your book, what was the first seed of it, and I guess we can start with you, Danielle.
Oh yeah, sure. So the seed of the book, when I first started writing it, it was in the winter of 2014. It was like 6 months after about 6 months after my mother had passed away. And I had taken some notes sort of in the weeks after that she had died, but that winter was particularly, like, there was this huge blizzard at one point, and I was working a bunch of temporary and free jobs. And so I was just like working all the time and exhausted. And then I just started calling out of work and writing in like the dark of this big old drafty house in Dorchester. So like south part of like the greater Boston area. And it really started with these letters that I was writing to my sister. She was in jail. She was serving an old warrant, and I had a really hard time talking about what I was doing in my life at that moment because I wasn't really doing anything. And so I just started writing, about our childhood and all the memories I had of our mother, and just mailing her off in these gigantic envelopes.
K-Ming, how did your novel start?
Yeah, mine actually, it came out of an assignment that I had in class. And it was a prose assignment. I was like, I don't know how to write prose. I'm mostly written poetry. So I was very, very intimidated. And I was like, it has to be cohesive and have a plot and character and all of these elements. But in my mind, it would revolve around this figure of a patriarch. But what was really interesting is that through writing that, I realized that it was actually about the women. It was about the women who were responding and reacting to the patriarch, and not about him at all. So it really kind of subverted my own expectations and surprised me a lot. And I began to think more about the women and how they could be kind of the backbone of the story.
That's really interesting, because I feel like in some ways, although we started with your mom, Danielle, there was many different shifts and turns of your memoir, and in some ways it kind of went further into your father, and at the end I think it still went back to not just your mom but your sister, and so it's interesting that K-Ming, yours is also, it took kind of that route. And so, I think both of you have these like recurring themes of like unveiling family secrets or, unveiling these kind of truths. And, for you, K-Ming, I mean, it's quite literally in your novel where the narrator, there's this like amazing thread where there is a hole in the backyard, and these letters fly up from the hole. So they're flying up from the ground, which I've always loved because it feels like it's sprouting. The earth is throwing up these letters that the grandmother of the main character had written. So how do these like family secrets and kind of these inner workings of these matriarchal characters, like how did that work into your book? How did that come to be?
Yeah, well, I really didn't want the actual facts of what the women were describing to be like the punchline, or for that to be the point. So I remember at one point I was thinking, oh, should I make it this kind of long drawn out reveal of what actually happened, of what acts they did commit, because they do commit these acts of violence in the book. But I didn't want that to be, for it to feel like a punchline at the end of it, or for the actual thing that they discover to be the only thing. I wanted it to also be, so I wanted to put what actually happened up front, and then to have it, I don't know, kind of almost unravel around them, and for all these different facets. So less about what actually happened, and more about like their interiority, the why, the context of their actions, the history, kind of intergenerational inheritances, to kind of move away from that question of what actually happened. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that figuring out and trying to write through kind of these intergenerational, traumas, but also joys and stories to some extent, and stories and maybe myths that don't always make sense, but that kind of follow you from person to person. And so Danielle is, I don't think I read this in your bio, but Danielle is also an archivist. And so, archiving, can you talk a little bit about your process of archiving, your mother's things and how you found them and then how they made their way into the book?
Yeah, no, it's interesting that K-Ming, you mentioned like moving away from, or that, finding out what actually happened, that doesn't feel like a resolution, because that's one of the things that I think I started realizing as I was working on my own book, was that, when my mom passed away, there was a suitcase of her letters and her diaries. And I think that I was pretty naive when I'm like, well, now I can have some of these answers, because we didn't get to have that final conversation. Like there was no confrontation. There was no like resolution to my life with her, or my relationship with her. And yeah, I think it was naive when I was like, well, I can find some of those answers in her letters, or like in these thoughts that she's recording or she's writing down. And I think that came out of my archival background, because when you're working in an archive, when you have a collection, often, like you're keeping records that have some kind of like evidentiary value, is one of the words that some people sometimes use, that can be used to like prove something or document something. But as I was like reading my mother's diaries and looking through photos, I started to realize the limits of like what kind of evidence those things could actually provide for anything, and how many different ways you could interpret it or misinterpret it. And yeah, that was like sort of a hard and painful truth that I slowly learned as I was writing the book, that all of these things that I was discovering weren't really necessarily like my mother's truth. They were my truth, and they were the way that I had to understand, anything that I was learning.
And how did you envision, I guess, how the archive would balance out the actual narrative? Like when you started writing the story, when you were thinking about the craft of, creating a memoir, how did you at first think that, the archive would work with it? And then how did it actually, or maybe it stayed the same way that you thought it was going to work?
Yeah, no, like my book had a lot of drafts and a lot of failed experiments. And so at one point, I'm like, this is going to be a documentary poetry project. I'm just going to have, I'm just going to be doing like erasures and like the archive is really going to be the book itself. But then I started feeling more anxious about, that tension of what my mother would want to have out there in the world and what I'm comfortable with. And I think, out of everyone in my family, I am the one who is most comfortable or most open. And that I really had to pull back on that. Well, I'll just put everything out there and then like figure it out or like sort of puzzle through it. And so then the archive, like in even the thesis version that I turned in, I had Jamie Lee, an archivist, like on my thesis committee. And when I turned it into, my committee, I'm like, man, there's not even an archive here, really. like, sorry, Jamie, I'm wasting your time. I'll put it in later. And I remember in the editorial process, you really had to push me. You're like, can I have more of the archive? And having to like find ways of bringing that back in.
Yeah, something I wanted to ask both of you, and I thought I would ask this later, but I'm just gonna go for it now. I think this is actually a really hard thing for a lot of writers, and it doesn't matter whether it's memoir or fiction or poetry. Maybe there's a certain kind of hardness about this when it's memoir because you're saying this is what happened to me. But how have you both? Did you have to get over the hump of that kind of shame that comes, especially for a lot of people of color, that comes with like telling family secrets or writing these family truths? Did you have to like get over that at some point? And did you do that in the beginning, or did you feel like you had to do that through the editing process while you were working on your books? Either of you can go first.
Well, I can talk. I think for me, the idea of telling something slant is it really resonates with me, and I think I'm so interested in the speculative elements. Like there's a lot of fantasy and magical realism in my book, not just because I'm interested in like subverting realities, but also because I'm really fascinated by the vehicles of storytelling as well, and the way that language can help, I guess, like unravel these truths, but also, I don't know, Maxine Huntington talks about like this thing called the crooked path, this idea that there's a kind of safety to kind of telling the story in a crooked way. And I'm really interested in, stories that are kind of crooked or pointing towards the truth, but also have a facade or have all these different elements, or like stories wrapped within stories, and the complicatedness of that. So maybe that's the opposite of what you're asking for, because I'm talking about like layers and layers and layers of truths, all of which are kind of each doing their own thing. But I think that helps me a lot. Yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up speculation, because I think, my sister certainly, when I first started, the first time I was sending it to her, she was like really excited. And she's like, yeah, this is great. Like her friends she was sharing it with her friends and she was like, they think it's great. You should keep going. And then, she would have these moments later where she would be like, why can't you write it as fiction? Like, why can't you change the names? Like, why can't you change all of these different things? And for me, part of the reason that it couldn't be fiction was that it felt like I was trying to figure out like what was real about my life and what wasn't. Like, there were so many things that I was told that just weren't true, and that skewed my perspective of not just like the people in my family, but also my relationship to those people. That it felt like part of it was just, I was just trying to figure out what was going on and how did we all get to where we were, and that felt really important to me. But I read a really interesting memoir like earlier this year or last year, by Rose Anderson, and The Heart and Other Monsters, I think is what it's called. And that speculative element appeared in there. And I thought it was really cool because she had photographs. And so there was this documentary element to it, but then there was also these speculative chapters where she was imagining these moments from all of these different perspectives. And I thought, yeah, I don't know. So I think there's a lot of ways to do it. But for me, it really was like, it had to be kind of this almost like, I don't know, analytical, sort of far back way of approaching some of it.
Yeah, it's interesting when, you know, when we're doing these ideas and action events, we often look at all of our authors together and we think like, who should we pair up and stuff. And I mean, well, I've kind of always had in mind that I would love to talk to both of you at the same time, partially, I think, because I think you both are kind of wizards of subtraction. Like, I think the way that the decisions you both have made to take out certain elements. I mean, actually, in the letters that the narrator gets from the ground in K-Ming's book, they're like almost blanks, you know. And you know, Danielle, obviously, we've worked intimately on your book, and there are things you've chosen not to write, or as you were writing, you almost took out some of the elements because, you know, I think there were central questions you guys were trying to answer. And I mean, I always find that fascinating. It's something as an editor, you know, it's like one of the, I guess, criterias of who we work with at One World. You know, there's like this third layer of the process. And so I'm curious if there were certain mysteries that you were trying to solve at the beginning of the book, and then, you know, towards the end, because there's always an evolution. What did you feel like, I guess, the book was answering or asking?
I was about to say I think it's so apt that you brought up the letters, because the letters in the first few drafts that I had were written in more like prose style, full sentences. And I actually realized that that this character embodied the unknowable in a lot of ways, and that I, as the writer, had to be comfortable with that. And realized that the grandmother, because I was writing those letters and part translation, part, you know, invention, was thinking, I don't understand her motivations, her desires, her choices. And I was writing in a way to kind of figure it out, quote unquote. But I realized that part of her voice, it was really important to have those moments of subtraction and those moments of like veering towards something, but then veering away, because she did want to be unknowable in a lot of ways. And that her own desires were something that she had to that she couldn't quite grasp herself, and that in some ways the reason for her writing was because of that, was because she herself was trying to like grapple with her own desires and her own motivations. And so that I basically learned, oh, okay, then I can just kind of move away from this desire to have everything be really cohesive and conclusive, and for it to be very I don't know, like whatever my idea of sense was. And so it was kind of letting go of that, and letting go of control in some ways.
Oh, that's really interesting. There are definitely like parallels there when you put it like that. Because I thought the question that I was asking when I first started writing the book, I was just like trying to figure out who my mother was, you know, apart from me, in relation to me. And it took a while for me to realize that she ultimately was unknowable, that I wasn't going to find the answers that I was looking for. And then the question that, you know, a question that I often got as I was workshopping this book early on, or showing, like reading parts of it to people, was like, well, how did you feel in these moments? Or you know, like that was often a question I would get a little bit frustrated by, because when my feelings were so complicated about it, and I'm like, well, I'm not really interested in how I feel necessarily. like I but that question was really about, you know, like I am a character in a book, and it took me a while to realize that, like, how, well, I am a character in a book, and something is changing. And so what is that question, I guess? And the question that I landed on, or what I felt like I was trying to explore by the end of the book, was like, what does it mean to take care of the people that you love, especially when the people that you love and those relationships are so complicated by substance abuse and addiction. And when taking care of someone can so often be conflated with like enabling rather than like truly supporting someone. So I think that ultimately that was the question I was trying to answer.
And then just to follow up on that, when you realized, I guess, that second question, when you realized like, I am a character in this book, did you feel like you had to step into the narrative more and almost have the family retreat a little bit, and kind of own the story in a different way? And then I guess for you, K-Ming, it's almost the opposite, where did you feel like, I remember in the editing process, I think the way that the kind of choir of, the chorus of the family, it changed where they were embodying their own voice and the narrator almost stepped back. So it's almost like you guys did opposite, things.
Yeah, I can start. I think I did, like I was like, yes, I'm a character. Yes, I need to be here. But it was really hard for me. The way that I wrote the book or the way my writing process looks like, it's very associative. It's very like memory linked to memory, linked to memory. And sometimes it takes a while for me to figure out like, what are the bridges? Like, how do I invite someone into like those associative moments? And so, yeah, I certainly did have to work very hard to like build those bridges along the way.
Yeah, for me, I definitely think there was a kind of collapsing of the generations in the way that their voices began to really blend together. And I was really interested in the ways that, the narrator isn't really a singular I, that because of what they've inherited and also their environment, that they've kind of, or she has kind of porously fused with the voices that are around her as well. And there's like a moment where her syntax kind of breaks down and mimics the grandmother's. And there are different ways where she begins to mother her mother. And all of these roles are not really, I think, maybe defined in the way that we're used to. And yeah, I was really interested in, I don't know, for there also to be this like historical, linkage between them, but also this intimacy, so intimate that their voices kind of take on characteristics of each other.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking about like that kind of collapse that you're talking about, K-Ming. I think something that happened from there is that we as a reader started to like gutturally feel each of the characters in a different way. Like I feel like I could like taste what Ben, which is one of the characters, could taste, or like feel what the grandmother was trying to get the character like to deeply understand. I mean, you're both very physical writers. I think you both write like deeply about the body, which is my favorite thing. So makes sense that I work with you both. But I am curious, I mean, I have a bunch of other questions, so I'm trying not to take up so much time. But one of the questions is that, K-Ming, you're obviously a poet and you started with poetry. So I'm wondering, how poetry obviously influenced your writing and how it still influences. We're working on a short story collection, which is very exciting. And then Danielle, I think it's interesting because your bio says that you are a nonfiction writer, and yet you also, I think, dabble in fiction, especially in the sci-fi, like fantasy realm. And you love world building in other ways, like in video games and things like that. So I'm wondering how both of, your individual passions have influenced this writing.
Yeah, well, I think for me, poetry really liberated me in so many ways with language, because I think before that, my experience with language is, like grammar, and it's very kind of punitive relationship to language where you're doing it right or you're doing it wrong, and here's an F. And so poetry kind of broke apart those certain rubrics I had in my mind of what language could do and what was possible with language. There was like, oh yeah, no punctuation, no capitalism, like do what you want, like this place of play. And also that language could be delight and pleasure as well. And so I think learning to write or writing poetry freed me in a lot of ways with language. And that kind of translated into my prose as well. And I mean, I also just don't know how to plot. So maybe that's my excuse. But I usually, in whatever genre, try to let the language lead me, and for like the sonic quality of the words as well, which sometimes leads me very astray, very, very astray. But sometimes it leads me to places that are, you know, delightful or joyful or embodied. So could go either way, basically.
Oh, that's really like I'm a pretty quick reader. Like I can like, really read things very quickly. But Bestiary was one of those ones where I really had to slow down, where like the language was so important to it that I could not skim it. Like I just couldn't. I tried. But yeah, what was the question, Nicole? I forget what the question was.
Really quick before I tell you the question, I was just editing some of K-Ming's stories, and one of the stories was like literally 5 pages, and it took me an hour to edit it because I was like, oh, I'm reading it. Oh wait, you're supposed to be editing it. Oh wait, but the sentence I love, let me write this on the board. Like I have a little board that I write down the things I love. And then I was like, oh, you're editing it. Like it just took me so long because you really force the reader to slow down, which I think is actually very hard to do as a writer. But just wondering about, you know, like through your love of video games and your love of, you know, sci-fi and fantasy, how that influenced specifically like this memoir or your archival work, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that those things influenced the memoir. I wouldn't call myself a poet, but what I was reading when I was writing this book was a lot of documentary poetry. So I like Knox and Lily Longsoldier's Whereas and Eleni Siklianos' The Book of John. Like those were all books that I was just devouring as I was reading. Um, but I certainly do. It's weird. I haven't really published much in the way of fiction, but that's mostly what I'm teaching up here in Victoria. So I'm reading, like I've sort of shifted and I'm reading a lot more fiction. And I would love to, I have a sci-fi book that I really want to finish writing, but unfortunately there's a lot of research trips that I think I need to take as I'm writing it. And so the pandemic has kind of slowed me down. Like I had a trip planned to the interior of BC, which is all high mountain desert, and the landscape, from what I've been told and what I've heard and what I've seen from like Google photos, it's really similar to the land in the Four Corners area, like where my family's from on the reservation. So no, like I think that that is one of my dream next books. Is I've got a lot of characters and ideas for it.
I just
We're
want
very
to
excited.
express excitement and wholehearted enthusiasm. Like I'll just be your cheerleader here. Sci-fi, yes, absolutely.
Me too. I'm very excited. Um, Speaking of like playing a little bit more, you know, I'm about to talk about birds, so I'm not sure why I thought of playing, but well, first of all, I should say to everyone in the audience that Danielle made me, like her work made me want to start bird watching, which I was like, I don't even know if this is a thing that I would do, you know? But I became quite intrigued by it, and you know, the serenity that comes from it and the way that it made me start listening, which I think, you know, reading and editing and writing is really about deeply listening. So I'm just curious for both of you what the role of, you know, the natural world has played in your writing and in your maybe, you know, and what moves you, what inspires you. K-Ming, you have birds on your background, so I think you have to go
I know I was about to
first.
be like this when you were talking, but I thought it'd be too distracting. But yeah, no, I learned the word anthropomorphic from someone who had read the book and told me about it, because there are so many kind of human animal fusions throughout the book. But yeah, I think it does come from a lot of the mythology that I grew up with, where, you know, rather than in kind of the Western literary canon, you know, they're like humans are the like highest beings and animals are like lower. I was really used to hearing about like animal gods, snake gods and snail gods and slug gods, and this kind of elemental mythic power within the animal that is also fused with the human, and also a lot of like human animal breeding into other gods and demigods. And I think that mythic world was really important to me also in writing these women who are indigenous Taiwanese women. And yeah, and I think something about birds, like I feel like I want to apologize to birds almost for how much we've projected onto them. Like we're like, birds are the symbol of freedom and the symbol of peace. And I'm just like, I think we just really love to project meaning onto birds and flight. But I'm also just, yeah, really interested in, in all of those projected meanings too, I think, yeah.
Yeah, for me, I think the natural world has always been like a place of like peace for me. Like the chaos of my childhood and growing up, and I, my grandma would always like make fun of me, but whenever I'd get really upset, I'd be just like, leave me alone, and like shut myself in my room. And when that stopped working, I just like run out of the house and like into the woods. And so I think, I think that's how it often functions in my writing, is that like the moments when I need to just sort of like retreat inside myself, that's when I'm actually like looking out and just observing like little lizards and birds, like living their like little lives sort of outside of mine. And especially in Boston, which is so loud, like I don't think I could ever live in a city again. But just those days that I would go to a cemetery, because those were like, that was the green space in the city, and that's where I could watch like a flicker foraging in the grass or a nighthawk in the sky. Those were really valuable, very important moments for me.
Well, it's interesting that you brought up flight, K-Ming, because you both actually do have flight and a lot of movement in your books. I mean, there's quite literally a brother who can fly in K-Ming's book. So I am curious. I was going to ask you guys, how you incorporate movement, or if you felt movement was the kind of tension moving the book forward. Especially Danielle, there's a lot of like physical movement. There's a lot of states in the book. And how, as a writer, you incorporated that, I guess, into the text.
Yeah, I think I'm really interested in like bodily transformation, and I think part of it is it does come out of language and the feeling that language can be alchemy, and that metaphor is this very magical thing. And I think like specifically about flight and the brother, I was really interested in that image of flight that's also tethered, which was like this mental oxymoron that I had in my mind, that there could be something like a kite that's flying, but it's also rooted to the ground. And that idea of being weightless and rooted at the same time was something that was a contradiction that I kept leaning into, and was really fascinated by. And this idea of like a person trying to steer a kite, and like steer this thing that is, in like flying above the person. And so that's where I think that image, that contradiction, especially like in the context for the characters, this kind of like illusion of flight as well, I think was something I was really interested in exploring. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, there is a lot of physical movement, a lot of distance crossed. And then often it felt like, when my mom left the reservation and moved from Southern Arizona to Florida, I guess she was in Albuquerque when she moved to Florida, but I think that she thought that she could just like move far away and that South Florida was her new home and she could leave everything behind. But that is an illusion, or like a lie that you tell yourself. And I thought the same thing when I left, college in central Pennsylvania and I moved to Boston, and I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna move away from my family and I'm not gonna answer my phone. And I'm just gonna like live my little life here and play a lot of video games. And it's not really, that kind of movement isn't really an escape the way that you think it is. And it's so easy, I think there's a line in my book where it's like one phone call, like one text message, and you're back where you were. That those kinds of connections can actually be severed by distance, like especially familial connection.
Well, I just wanted to say that really oh, sorry.
No, go.
Oh no, I just wanted to say that really resonated with me, because I remember when I was writing about like the family moving from Taiwan to Arkansas and that migration. I remember talking to my mom, because she immigrated to Arkansas when she was young, and she would tell me, I would be like, oh, it must have been so different. Like I had all of these kind of preconceived ideas of what that escape or migration would look like. And she would be like, oh my God, we got there. It was such a scam. The weather was the same. The landscape was the same. There was wild taro growing in the fields. It was the same. It's the same weather, the same rain, it was humid. It was the same place. We were doing the same jobs. And I just thought that was such a fascinating kind of subversion of the immigrant narrative. And I found it deeply ironic too, that, the environment can be the same. The jobs you're doing are the same. Your relationship to bosses, to the environment, still the same. But just the fact that, it's kind of illusion too, of like, oh, somehow this is making it, or whatever the narrative is. And so, I just really resonated with that. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask one more before I have to turn it over to audience Q&A. Like I said, I could ask a million. But if you're comfortable sharing, I'm curious what your favorite, or one of your favorite, myths are. There's a lot of myths in both of your books, and I'm just curious, one of your favorites that's maybe in the book or that's not in the book.
Well, I can start with mine. Mine is so, like, I've talked about it so much. I'm sure everyone's like so tired of me talking about it all the time, but it's the central myth in the book of the tiger spirit. She is living inside of a woman's body, but my favorite thing about her myth is that she eats the toes of children and she calls them peanuts. I don't know why I'm so equally horrified and delighted by that. I find that so charming, and I know she's supposed to be a villain, but I'm just so deeply endeared and charmed by this detail. Now toes and peanuts, they're always just inextricably entwined in my mind.
That's so funny that it, like, charming is the word. Because my reaction to reading that image, or like the image of like the toes in the tin, I'm just like, oh no. Oh, like oh no. I think, thinking about myth, it's a dangerous word to use when you're talking about like an indigenous stories, because it puts it in the world or the realm of fantasy, whereas these are beliefs that people hold. And so I think, as far as like my favorite myth or mythology, I don't even know if Grendel, like the story of like Grendel, is like, if you would call that a myth, but I took a lot of like old English classes in my undergrad, and I really fell in love with those stories and like old saints tales and stuff, which again are like charming and how horrific they can be. But yeah.
I love that. Thank you. I will turn it to the audience Q&A. So the first question is for you, Danielle. You mentioned some failed experiments along the way. Think you'll be revisiting any of those?
Yeah, I think so. I do have some erasures from my mother's collection that I'd like to revisit. And then there are a couple of cameras. So like they're the old disposable cameras where you like take 25 pictures and then you take it to the pharmacy and they develop it. And there are a couple of those on my mom's things that I was a little bit too nervous to develop when I first started going through her belongings, because there was one that was much older than the others. And so some of them I could be like, oh, well, she didn't have the money or the time to get them developed before she passed away. But this one, like the cardboard was all like it was a different brand. The cardboard was all beaten up. And I'm like, there's a reason that she didn't develop that camera. And I finally this year did get that film developed. And you know, the reason that she didn't develop that camera was because it was a bunch of pictures of my younger sister when she was born and when she was being adopted by the family. And I started understanding sort of those things that, again, she had experienced and just really didn't know how to deal with. And I think that when I go back and revisit some of that material, I want to find a way to write about those negative images.
This is for you both. As a reader, I truly felt like I learned the many different layers of intergenerational trauma in both books. I'd love to know if either of you learned something different through writing. Oh, I love that question.
Yeah, I think writing the book was a journey. It was a personal journey myself, because I think this is maybe a bit spoilery, but I had like an alternate ending of the book where the girl, like, she severs her tiger tail, and I realized that there was a kind of too clean, too neat kind of feeling to that, of her completely dissociating herself from that tail and the legacy that she's embodied. And I realized that it was always going to be this, I don't know, double-edged sword, this thing of like multiple meanings. And that similarly, what she's inherited, there's no kind of, I don't know, clean exorcism or whatever the narrative is of like, oh, and you can somehow, I don't know, cleave it from yourself. And so I think putting away that cleaner ending and sitting a little bit more with like the uncertainty and the questions and the unresolvedness, I think was something I discovered while writing.
Yeah, I think for me, I think like what is said and what is unsaid and silence is a thing that holds a lot of tension in the book, and not just like what I say or don't say, but the people in my life. And for me, you know, I've always been like, well, if we talk about it, we can, like, that'll start the healing, or it'll be better if we can just talk about it. But I think the hard lesson I've had to learn is that, you know, there are people in my life where they're not ready to have those conversations, and rather than pushing, like, you know, like I can't force those conversations to happen. I just have to. I listen, and I offer less of my opinions, and I try less to be like, well, do it this way, or like, you know, like I know best. Do these things the way that I say to do them, because I like that doesn't work for everyone.
This is also for both of you. What is one idea you hope will resonate with the reader after reading your book? I almost want to answer that for you guys.
Answer it for me.
No.
That's so hard. Answer it for me, Nicole.
Yeah,
You're so wise.
It won't be fair to the listeners. They want to hear from you.
Oh, that is so difficult. Well, I guess one thing, maybe this is more like a theme rather than an idea, but I think finding lineages everywhere is something in Bestiary I wanted to play around with. Like there's this matriarchal lineage, but also she's forging her own lineages in all directions, horizontal, you know, top down, bottom, like all of these lineages. And I think, yeah, I was really interested in playing with what, you know, a lineage could look like or be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the ideas that I really struggled with was, and I wonder if this, I think part of it comes from, you know, growing up Catholic and going to Catholic school. It's this idea of forgiveness, that if you can forgive someone of something, then it can't hurt you anymore. And I'm like, you know, how many times have I told my dad that I forgive him? How many times has he heard that and still kept doing the same things over and over again? And so I had to let go of that idea of forgiveness as a kind of resolution and learn a kind of compassion for just that for myself and for, my dad and my mom, for like all those things that we had done to like hurt each other. And I'm thinking, like I don't know that there are many things I did to hurt my dad or my mother, but like certainly my sister and the harm that I caused. And, you know, maybe one day there is forgiveness, but it doesn't have to happen for a relationship to be repaired or for you to find comfort or yeah.
Hmm. I'm going to answer because I love both of your answers, but also because I have, the deep honor, and it really does make me emotional to have worked on both of your books in multiple drafts. So, as an editor, I feel like I learned a lot about not just craft, but about life. And Danielle, I think your book, the one thing I wanted, so badly for people to feel when they read this was that, I think a lot of memoirs, especially memoirs of family trauma, it happens, it's written after some big kind of revelation where everything is okay, and it's not a lot of writing through trying to find joy and trying to survive and all of those things. And so I think there's the element of forgiveness and then there's the element of choice that a lot of people don't feel they have. And I think you taught me that we have a choice, and it's okay if the choice is not to care for either parent but to care for siblings or friends or significant others, that we can redistribute that care in some way. I've never read that before, especially in a memoir, which is why I thought your story was so revolutionary. And it's interesting because, as Danielle said, there's many drafts and that ending didn't come to the last draft, and then once I read that last one, I texted her, I was like, I'm crying, this is it, like this is huge, and then it K-Ming, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that this book Bestiary did, but also your writing in general. And I think the number one thing is it taught me that my desires matter, and like my most inner desires that I don't want to share with anyone, they matter, and that I can listen to them and live my life that way, that I can live my life, as you're saying, through my own lineage, which doesn't mean I'm not honoring whoever came before me, but that I have desires and that they're worthy. So I'm just saying both those things to plug your books because they just mean so much to me. So this is a question for Danielle. Do you plan on archiving your own story? And if so, how?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Maybe, but I'm not sure what that looks like. If you look up here, there's like these two gray archival boxes, and they hold different things. One is a bunch of things that are related to my dad and my sister, and then one of them are the things that I've saved from my life. And that feels weird to say, but all the moving, all the different places I've had to go. Like when I moved from Tucson to Canada, I just had my little Toyota Yaris. Like I couldn't bring very much stuff with me. And so I'm constantly having to purge all of these things from my life. And so it's right now, like one of those little gray boxes has the things that are really important or that really matter. But the question is, like, when it comes to archives, like who are you saving this for? And that's a hard question to ask when it's like me, myself, right? Like, am I going to have kids? Like, probably, I don't know. It's a little uncertain. Is it for my family? Like what will matter to the people in my family and my life, decades from now, like after I'm gone? And I don't know that I'm ready to answer that question yet.
That reminds
and
me
then
of, sorry. Oh,
no.
No, I was about to say that reminds me of time capsules and how when I was a kid, everyone was really obsessed with, that you would like put one item into a shoebox and then duct tape it, or like you and your sibling or everyone in your family would put one thing into the shoebox and then bury it. my brother and I did actually do that. And I remember thinking, like, speaking like, who are the archives for? I was like, oh, the aliens are gonna come and find my like little teacup and be like, what are these like tiny people using these little teacups? Like, that was my fantasy. It was like extraterrestrial life. But anyway, so yeah, the questions you were thinking made me think of like time capsules and what are these things for? And what
K-Ming,
memories
that's my book idea. But then how do you provide enough context for aliens to understand what a teacup is? Yeah, it's hard. It's impossible.
Yeah. I'm loving this synergy. Oh my goodness.
I didn't even know her book idea. I've been trying to get it out of her for years, so finally I know. Okay, I'm gonna, we're almost out of time, so there's one last question, which is, in writing this book, did you find it to be cathartic? So in however you want to answer that, but I can also give an alternative question, which is, what would you want to show the aliens first about our world?
Yeah, I think I want to show them like a collection of birds, like taxidermied birds. Yeah. And then maybe cathartic. Yeah. Cathartic.
I was kind of thinking of that too. I was like the bones of something, like some skeletal remains. I don't know, a pearl, like a freshwater pearl, because that's so bizarre. And they'd be like, is this like made? Is this found? So yeah, pearls and bones.
I think that's a perfect place to end it. Pearls and bones. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight. And thank you all for being here and listening and asking such thoughtful questions.
Yeah, thanks. I couldn't see you all, but thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thank you guys. Have a great night.